Good evening. My name's Jane Joseph. I'm the CEO of the Melbourne Holocaust Museum. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. And as I pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging, I'd like to pause and consider the similarities between our peoples to the Jewish people to the First Nations people. We're both storytelling people, passing down stories from generation to generation. And also, more than storytelling, we share a tradition of truth-telling. Because each of us has suffered and each of us has a strong need for a reckoning with the past. And each of us has a need to keep our threatened cultures alive. And each of us needs to keep painful memories alive. And that's what we're here to discuss tonight, the need to preserve difficult memories in books. Those memories that have been passed on to us, they're too strong and too painful for us to contain. We have a duty to record them somehow and pass them on, to record them for posterity. And we do so in many ways, one of which is putting pen to paper or fingers to keyboard, and if we're fortunate, actually publishing those stories. So that was a long-winded introduction, but really what I wanted to do most was thank you for coming tonight and welcome you to our new home, our very special house of stories and memories. I welcome any Holocaust survivors amongst us tonight, including, of course, Michelle Huppert, one of our panellists. And our home here is your home, most particularly if you have family connections to the Holocaust. Some of our survivors used to say, I feel at home here, I can be with my family here, by which they meant, of course, their murdered family. This is one of the places, I mean, it sounds gruesome, but this is one of the places where they could talk about their murdered families, and somehow while they were here, those families were briefly alive for them again, as they shared stories with students and with visitors. So we invite you all to feel safe and nurtured in this home, where you hopefully can find peace in knowing that someone cares about your stories and someone wants to document them and protect them forever. This is such a place. And if that sounds strange, we all need to consider that it's genocide itself, which is actually what's strange. We, the Jewish people, had this done to us, and all we have left are these stories and a massive responsibility to keep them alive. So speaking of a massive responsibility, you might see here on the stage or to the right of the stage something very precious, the actual diary penned by Yitzhak Meir Kluska while in hiding during the Holocaust. More will be spoken about this later. But I just want to bring to your attention that part of our responsibility here is to care for such artefacts, and we take this very seriously. So seriously, in fact, that my brilliant manager of collections and research, Dr. Anna Hirsch, who's here tonight somewhere, she argued passionately with me against putting it on display because, and I totally respect why she did that. And I want you all to as well. Once an artefact is handed over to us, we do everything humanly possible to preserve it from any future damage. However, we balance this need with the need to share it with the public. The reality is that pages from this precious diary will be displayed in the museum in a secure case, in climate-controlled conditions, with appropriate low-level lighting and with periodic changeover of different pages to minimise damage. Here tonight, we're exposing them ever so briefly. So please, I invite you to come up and study this very rare artefact. The words beautifully written in such beautiful handwriting, but beautifully written in such atrocious conditions. And you'll hear more about that tonight. So tonight is a collaboration with Real Publishing, a local company established 11 years ago by Romy Moshinsky and Georgie Rake Allen. They publish memoirs, biographies and family histories. And if you're not already aware of this, their work is of a very high quality and the books look just beautiful. I love that they boast their print runs are from 1 to 1,000. So I want to know who asked for one only. You can tell me that later. So Romy Moshinsky originally studied arts law, but soon moved into documentary film production, where she developed a passion for the genre of life stories and eventually switched her focus to publishing biographies and books. Georgie Rake Allen studied history and journalism, followed by a master's in communication, which led her into editing and freelance writing. So I wish to hand over to Romy and Georgie to introduce our very special guest tonight. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Romy and I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and live. We honour all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first storytellers of Australia. We celebrate their traditions and cultures and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. We also pay our respects to the Holocaust survivors in the audience here tonight, including several of our wonderful clients. Thank you so much for being here. We would like to thank Jane Josem and Aviva Weinberg for encouraging us to co-host the event, to reinforce the importance of preserving survivor stories and to celebrate the power of books. Our collective aim is also to promote engagement with the Melbourne Holocaust Museum and to draw your attention to the incredible library and digital resources available here in this inspiring new museum space. Last year, Romy and I celebrated our 10-year anniversary of our business, Real Publishing. We have co-written, edited and published 44 books, including significantly 14 Holocaust memoirs. Most of these were private publications produced for family and friends, but several, including 2 of the books we will be hearing about tonight, are also available for sale online and at the Avenue Bookstore. There are also a few copies available here tonight for sale. Critically, all our Holocaust memoirs are archived here in the Museum Library, as well as in the State Library of Victoria and the National Library of Australia, as well as in Holocaust museums throughout the world. Our books are beautiful hardcover editions designed to be proudly displayed and to ensure longevity. To that end, we would like to acknowledge our talented book designers that we collaborate with regularly, including Trisha Garner, Jackie Starr and Mariana Berrick-Lewis. I would also like to highlight that if you have a family story to share, there are many publishing options available to you. We encourage you to browse the publisher directory on the Small Press Network website and to familiarise yourself with Ingram Spark, a print-on-demand and ebook resource. The Lamb Jewish Library has a fantastic Write Your Own Story program. And Debbie Lee, the director of Melbourne Jewish Book Week, has recently established a business called the Book Maven, which connects authors with publishing companies. And of course, please come and speak to us.
On Yom HaShoah, author Bram Presser spoke here at the museum about the critical importance of guarding authentic memories. He spoke of the need to work directly with survivors or, when that is no longer possible, working from testimony whilst ensuring at all times historical accuracy. He reinforced that as second and third generation writers, reckoning with the plight of our ancestors and our inherited responsibility to record and transmit their stories for posterity, we must be careful never to distort or minimise the Holocaust, nor to use the Holocaust merely as a dramatic setting for historical fiction. These remain our guiding principles. In doing so, we may also have to reckon with our own inherited trauma. Sometimes it is just too painful to write about the Holocaust experiences of a parent, grandparent, or great-grandparent. It's one of the reasons that families seek our services as independent memoirists. We often work directly with survivors or write books based on testimonies and the memories of descendants. Sometimes we are engaged as editors, and it was our great privilege to have edited and published the 3 books we will be discussing this evening. I might just grab them. Tonight is about the power of books, and these 3 books must be very powerful indeed to have drawn so many of you out on this cold winter's night. I'm delighted to invite the authors onto the stage, Genya Janova, Frances Prince and Ron Pillar. Genya is a celebrated educator and former principal of Bialik College. She is here to speak about the publication of the diary of her father, the late Yitzhak Klaska, which she wrote in Yiddish whilst hiding in a bunker for 694 days. In doing so, Genya has fulfilled what she considered to be a sacred duty to preserve his story. The original manuscript has been donated to this museum and will form an integral part of the permanent exhibition, as Jane has just pointed out. It's so special to have the diary here tonight, and thank you to Dr. Anna Hirsch. Frances Prince is also an educator with lifelong expertise in Jewish studies, Holocaust education and leadership in Victoria's interfaith community. Frances thought she knew a lot about the Holocaust and post-war experiences of her father, David Prince. But a reading ritual she developed to keep her father occupied during Melbourne's seemingly endless lockdowns revealed enough fascinating new material to inspire her to write a book. This book, Gift of Time, Discoveries from the Daily Ritual of Reading with My Father, which was published shortly before her beloved father passed away last year. Our third panellist is Ron Pillar. Ron is a lawyer whose two areas of expertise are technology contracts and the life and times of his father, Josh Pillar, who is here in the audience tonight. Welcome, Josh. Ron extracted his father's fascinating story over a period of several years to write this compelling book, Under a Lucky Star, My Father's Story of Survival Against the Odds. Please give them all a warm welcome. Okay, so all three of you have written books about your fathers. All of your fathers were born in Poland. They all miraculously survived the Holocaust, but tragically lost members of their immediate family. And then coincidentally, they all ended up in Munich after the war, where Genya was born. And ultimately, they settled here in Melbourne. But that's really where the similarities end, as you would expect. To set the scene for tonight, can I ask you all please to just give us a glimpse into your father's lives before, during and after the war? And perhaps, Genya, we could start with you.
Okay, thank you. My dad was 30 years old at the outbreak of the war. He came from an observant home in a town called Jędrzejów, not far from Kelts and about 75 kilometres from Krakow. It's not clear that he was born there because all the documentation that we hold say that he was born in Breslau, which sometimes belonged to Poland and sometimes belonged to Germany. So it's not quite clear that he was born in Jędrzejów, but he considered that as his hometown. He was one of 9 siblings. He was a political activist, and like so many other young, forward-thinking people of the time, he believed that communism was going to be the answer and that it would solve all the social injustices at the time. I think today you would call it socialism. He found out otherwise, and later in life he was far from a communist. But he believed that ideology was going to be the solution to many of the social ills at the time. And for his political activism, he spent 4 years in his 20s in a notorious Polish prison called Kartusz Bereza for political prisoners. And when he was released from there, he came back to Jędrzejów, but he was still being harassed for his political views. And so he set out to make a life and a living. He moved to Sosnowiec, then to Katowice, and then to Będzin. He fell in love and married a cousin, by the way, when he was 25 years old in 1935. And he established a successful business. And when things started to look very bad and grim, he, his wife, and a daughter who was born in 1937 moved back to Yangeov to be with their families. Incidentally, they moved back on the 1st of September 1939, which was the day that Germany invaded Poland.
And during the war, where did he find himself?
So during the war, on the 16th of September 1942, all the inhabitants of Yangeov and surroundings, some 6,000, were rounded up in the marketplace. 170 or so men were taken aside. They were people who were deemed important for the German war effort, and the rest were transported to Treblinka, where they were murdered on arrival. My father was housed in a barracks in the ghetto together with these other men. He had skills as a tailor and a furrier, and that was considered important for the war effort. Things got very bad in the barracks, and in February 1943, people who could started to source hiding places. And so in February 1943, my father entered a bunker, which I'll describe later, with 4 other men, and he was there for almost 2 years. A bunker that was 1.8 metres by 2 metres. They started with 4 people, they ended with 7, 6 men and a woman.
Thanks, Danielle. Francis, your father was a beloved guide here at the museum, and he shared his story with thousands of students over the years. Can you tell us a little bit about his story?
It's interesting, in your introduction, you talked about what we have in common and said that we obviously have a lot not in common. And one of the things is that my father was a child and your father was an adult and had a full life. My father was born in 1925, so he was 14 years old when the war broke out. He was born in Lodz, or Łódź, second largest city in Poland, and he was born within the heart of Jewish Lodz. His mother was Frimodt Chaya, after whom I am named, Francis Helen. His brother, his twin brother, which becomes a very important part of the story, Heniek, and their father, Israel. So they were actually a small, another difference, nuclear family, but the extended family was large, grandparents, a slew of cousins, aunts, uncles, and so on. Dad always considered that his home was a lower middle class home. His father, Israel Prince, was a draftsman. But in the last 4 years before the war, their economic situation improved because my grandfather had a job as a draftsman for the city of Lodz, for the city council. My father had a primary school education and 1 year of high school, which to him was very precious, and he would talk about again and again to the school kids when they came here. Dad's first language was Polish, which he spoke with his parents. To the grandparents, they spoke to him and his brother in Yiddish, but they seemed to answer in Polish. They were, I guess, what we call traditional Jews, which is the term I think we use in Melbourne for whatever one's family is. You always say it's traditional, and everyone else is something else. So they weren't strictly observant, but they certainly went to shul Friday nights, some Shabbat mornings, a kosher home. So it was that sort of household. When the war broke out, the Germans got to Lodz a week later on the 8th of September 1939, and Dad, like I know many other Lodz survivors, saw them arrive. It was a sight, these soldiers coming in, which Dad also described to the students. Straight away, there was a slew of sort of anti-Jewish decrees. My father's story parallels the general history of what happened to the Jews of Lodz. So to those familiar with that, you can sort of slot my father as one of those, a character in that sort of larger picture. The orders to move in the ghetto came quite early, but they closed the ghetto on the 1st of May 1940, meaning the non-Jews had to be out and the Jews had to be in, and people were scurrying for places to live. My dad's family didn't have such a difficult time because Dad had an aunt, my Chochamala, who was the youngest sister of his mother's, and she was only 11 years older than Dad, his favourite aunt. And she had just recently married and lived in the area that was within the designated borders, in the area called the Bawuti, which those who know is like the poorest, unsewered part of Lodge, and that's where the ghetto was. So they moved in with this young aunt and uncle. Late during the ghetto years, they moved to other places, and so on. I mean, I know. Tell me when to go on the sort of work they did.
Well, I think maybe if you could tell us where he was once he left the ghetto.
Okay, so my dad and both his parents and his brother were actually on the very last train from the Lodge ghetto to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And Lodge was the very large ghetto, last ghetto of all of Europe. So it's the 30th of August, 1944. The four of them were pushed onto that train. In the chaos upon arriving, Dad lost his mother straight away, sent to one side, while the three men, my grandfather and the two boys, were together. They lost her in a flash. As Dad always said, not a hug, not a kiss, didn't know what was going on, complete chaos. The three of them were in Auschwitz-Birkenau for 1 week. And as Dad always said, only 1 week. They were never processed upon entry. Dad didn't have a number, and neither did my Uncle Henrik, and neither did my grandfather. They didn't have work, they didn't have anything. What Dad said, they milled around these fields waiting to see what was going to happen. And all of a sudden, my father hears a calling out for metal workers, metal workers. And he hears it, he grabs his brother and his father and says, we are now metal workers. And out of a field, Dad says there was thousands upon thousands of men. They grabbed and they said they're metal workers. And it's a very unusual story, is that Dad has told us, they faced a selection on the way out. Now, to this day, and I can't even say to this day, but to my father's dying day at the end of March last year, he always said, I don't know why, but I changed our date of births. They made my grandfather, they said he was 10 years younger, and my father and uncle, twins, not identical twins, they made one born April, which they were born in April the year before, and the other one in July, a year ahead. They didn't have a clue what it meant to be in Auschwitz-Birkenau and be twins. They left and they were put on a train out of there after 1 week. They were in a work camp within Germany proper called Friedland, where they worked on putting together part of aeroplane propellers, and they were liberated, as Dad always said, on the 8th of May, the very last day of the war in Europe. And they were liberated by the Russians, but the Germans fled a few days before. So that's up to liberation.
Okay, and we'll come back to what happened to them after the war shortly. Ron, your dad was born in 1934.
Correct.
Not a good year.
Not a good year.
For a male boy, or a male
Jewish boy. Yes.
To be born in Poland. Can you tell us a bit about his wartime experiences?
Sure. So Josh's story is a bit unusual and doesn't really fit into the sort of standard survivor narratives. He was born in Sosnowiec, so we have an overlap there, which is very close to the German border, and it was occupied by the Germans within 3 days of the war commencing. At that time, Josh was 5 years old. There were deportations and public hangings right from the very first days. The great synagogue on Decatur Street was burnt down almost immediately. So there was trouble from day one. Over the ensuing years, Josh was in constant danger. In 1942, there was a major selection, and he was one of 8,000 Jews that were selected for transportation to Auschwitz and immediate extermination. He managed to escape from that situation, in fact, hidden under piles of bread in a delivery cart. For 8 months in the Schrodler ghetto, he spent 22 hours a day with his baby sister Rachel in a small, pitch dark, damp, underground hiding place. It was about 2.5 metres by 1.5 metres, so I guess similar sort of scale as you mentioned. The hiding place had a hidden entrance, accessible only through the oven, and it could only be opened from the outside. So they were there 22 hours a day, and they only came out for a couple of hours at sort of 2 a.m. to breathe a bit of fresh air. 3 times Josh escaped out of and then back into the Srodula ghetto for various reasons that are explained in the book. But that was sort of through barbed wire and armed guards and guard dogs and the whole thing. And then for the last year or so of the war, Josh was living, as they say, on the outside, in the general community, at times with his mother, Bronya, and with his sister Rachel, and at times alone. Josh's father, Solomon, and his brother, Menashe, were caught and murdered at Auschwitz. This last year was the most dangerous period for them. They moved constantly between towns in the Upper Silesia region. They had no fixed address. I think they counted 38 different places that they stayed over that period. They also had no papers, making them incredibly vulnerable. To exist without papers was unheard of. And if at any time they came under the slightest suspicion, they were lost. So it was a day-to-day existence under constant, unrelenting fear and threat. They had cover stories, they hid their true identities as best they could, but they couldn't be completely hidden. They had no choice but to interact with the community, the Polish community, because they needed to earn money and buy food. So they were hiding in plain sight. Josh, his mother and sister were liberated by the Russian army on 28 January 1945, the day after Auschwitz was liberated. At that stage, Josh was 10 years old. His sister Rachel was 4, and they had fought so hard to get her through the war, but she'd become very sick as a result of the various deprivations and died a few months later. So that sort of really covers the war years.
Ron, excuse my cracky voice. You've called your book Under a Lucky Star. Can you tell us why you chose that title?
So Josh was designated within his family and relatives as the lucky one, really from the day he was born. And he's always considered himself to be incredibly lucky. If you to ask him how did he survive the war, he would say, well, number 1, luck. Number 2, luck. Number 3, luck. Now, there's a healthy dose of irony here. Being born Jewish in the mid-1930s in Western Poland, close to the German border, was incredibly unlucky. The odds against his survival were huge. The survival rate for Jewish children who remained in Poland throughout the war was really minuscule. But they say to be lucky is a blessing. But to my mind, an even greater blessing is to feel lucky. And it's pretty special that after all that he has experienced, Josh feels lucky. And so the name Under a Lucky Star just seemed natural.
But your dad was also very street smart, wasn't he?
He was.
I think there's a passage somewhere, might even get you to read it. I think it's maybe page 75. Where you talk about the aspects of his personality that really came to the fore.
Yeah. So this is really talking about the period when he was on the outside, in the community, basically having to, well, sometimes fend for himself and sometimes with his mother. So I'll just read a couple of paragraphs here. Every one of the hundreds of minor decisions made every day, where to walk, what to eat, where to sleep, which corner to turn, was laced with danger. Any wrong decision, any slight misstep or misjudgment could be fatal. And yet there was no way to know, other than with hindsight, what the right decisions were. This is where aspects of Josh's personality came to the fore. Even at the age of 9, he was decisive, confident, disciplined, and careful. He did not dwell on situations or second-guess himself. He was driven by pragmatism rather than emotion, and his analytical mind allowed him to assess every situation coolly and methodically. It never occurred to Josh to give up or concede defeat. As long as he was alive, there was hope, and everything he did was directed at staying alive. He wasted no time thinking about the past, dreaming about the future, when the nightmare might end. He lived in the moment, looking only to the near-term horizon.
I think you had one more passage that you wanted to read out, and then we'll
Sure.
about the time that Josh was living on his own in the street.
It was. So a Holocaust survivor's story is really a series of moments. Often these are moments of crushing devastation, but sometimes they're of euphoria and incredible luck. So the excerpt I would like to read recounts what, to me, is the most significant moment. And in fact, it's a moment of pure good fortune. And I have no doubt that absent this encounter that I'm going to read, this story would not have had a happy ending. And, well, I wouldn't be sitting here in front of you. So just to give it a bit of context, it's early 1944, and Josh is on the outside. He's in the general community, and he's completely alone. So he'd been living for a couple of months, basically the life of a young Christian boy with two older women. But when they started to get suspicious about him, he ran away into the night with no place to go. So at this stage, he's lost contact with the rest of his family. He's got every reason to believe that they've been caught by the Nazis. He's living rough. He's sleeping on the snow-covered streets. He's hiding in movie cinemas when he can. He's quite sick. He's moving from town to town in Upper Silesia and making life and death decisions in every moment of every day. And he is all of 9 years old. With his health deteriorating, his energy levels depleting, and his money running out, there was only so long that Josh could tread water before slipping between the waves and drowning. There was nothing for Josh to do but to get through each day, survive another freezing night, and see what the next day would bring. In mid-March 1944, as the long cold winter was finally drawing to a close, and after Josh had spent close to 3 weeks on his own, one of those next days brought a miracle. Walking down the street in the town of Bismarckhitte, Josh noticed a lady coming towards him carrying a small child. In profile and gait, she resembled his mother. Josh caught his breath, and his heart started to race. Could this be Bronya and Rachel? It was hard to be sure, as the woman was rugged up against the cold, and the climate of fear was such that Josh didn't dare to look at her too closely, to catch her eye, or to show any hint of recognition. She clearly felt the same. The two walked right past each other without uttering a word. They each walked another 30 paces or so before tentatively turning to look around. That simultaneous act was all the confirmation they needed. Against all odds, a mother and her 9-year-old son had found each other. They reunited with an embrace, conscious not to raise suspicion by being overly demonstrative in the middle of the street. Even at this most euphoric of moments, they could not let their guard down. And I'll leave it there. I go on to describe the reunion, but I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks. Okay, moving on to Francis. Francis, your book kind of defies categorization. It's a very unusual book, and it's actually a testament to the power of books. Can you tell us about the discovery of one very special book and how that became the catalyst for your book?
Okay. Mine really is an accidental, unintended book. We've all heard enough about coronavirus, but it is the context. My father lives around the corner. He's on his own. My brother and I, not sure what to do to keep him occupied. He's busy. and now he can't go anywhere. I don't know what to do with him to keep him going. At the same time, I discovered this book online, The New Life, Jewish Students of Post-War Germany by Jeremy Varon. If I go and take a step back to what I talked about, my father and his brother and their father being liberated after the war, they lived in Germany and they went to Regensburg after the war. My father went with a close friend, Aaron Lukretz, who I met many years later, decided to go to Munich, the two of them. They're 21 years old. And they hear about a program that very few people to this day, even Holocaust studies academics, don't know about. There was a program within Munich, Bavaria, specifically for Jewish students whose schooling had been interrupted, so to speak, by the war, to fast track them into university studies. Arik and my dad heard about it. They said, let's explore, let's find out more. And they found out there was something called the Jewish Students' Union. Now, Izzy, my brother and I, the Jewish Students' Union in our house was venerated. This was the organisation that made this pathway to university education possible. They provided exam supervision, preparation, the finances, the entrance, getting this is the American zone to get permission from the German universities, an astonishing program. My dad studied for exams. As he has always said, and we grew up with, I worked like a dog. How could I even aspire about such a thing? And if we think about it, in 1938, he finished year 7. Here he is in 1946 trying to enter the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. And him and Arik, they move into a living with a German couple. You know, you think, oh, you know, they move in with someone. They lived in a room within this elderly couple's house. They sold the packages that they got from the Joint Distribution Committee. That enabled them to hire a tutor and prepare them for the entrance, the grueling entrance exams. My father passed, he studied pharmacy. At the same time, and unbeknownst to him, my mother, with her mother who survived, is going through the same process, and she enters the university. She didn't even finish primary school before the war, and she's studying dentistry, which her mother had been a dentist. My parents met at the Jewish Students' Union kosher cafeteria. The romance took place there, as I believe, and I know other romances did, and how could they not? They were 21, 22 years of age. And my parents then, after 3 months of their romance, their courting, got married in December 1947. They then moved together again into the room at another German family's house. They were both still students. My father graduated from pharmacy. My mother did not graduate from dentistry, and that's my personal bugbear, which I write about. And they left for Australia in December 49, arriving here January 1950. I know a lot about my dad's story, both before, during, and after. I'm one of those very lucky people. Dad talked. Did I ask enough? Of course not. But Dad talked. And I had met a lot of his friends who studied with him. Most did not come to Australia, as you can imagine. The vast majority who had been students and then qualified as professionals either went to the United States or to Israel. Precious few came to Australia. But when I went with my parents to Israel the first time, the second time, they were out all the time. I was sort of left. They were partying left, right, and centre. And they were all these people. And the same when I first went to the United States with a girlfriend during uni. I had a long list of people to ring to say hello, like if I'm Ella and David, and like, what was I going to say? I didn't care who were these people. They were all these survivor students, and that's what I call them in my book. But the backstory, how did this all happen? This fellow, a historian, American historian, he had done the research a long time ago. This is not a new book. It was published in 2014. And I don't know how on earth I missed it, because I look sporadically for these sorts of things. There is barely anything in any academic work in English. And all of a sudden, at the same time that as what happened to us in Melbourne with the coronavirus lockdowns, I find this book. So I was going to say, then I got Book Depository. I say Oliver Shalom on that one as well. But anyway, they got it delivered, and then I knew what I was going to do with my dad. Read to him. Now, Dad was, a reasonable reader, but as soon as I opened it up in his, diminished state, Dad's already in 94, small writing. It's basically an academic work. The footnotes, all of that, which I love, but I could see the writing. It's not going to be enjoyable for Dad. So then I realized that's what I'm going to do with him. I'm going to read to him. And that's what I did. My darling brother did all the hard work. He took Dad to the doctor's appointments. He did the food shopping. He took care of all the errands. Dad used to live a few doors from where Dad lived. He come around on the little stroller to my place. I had the cup of tea cool down, the lemon, the saccharin, the blankets ready, which is sort of the front picture of my book. We'd get all ready and we would begin our reading almost every single day for most of the corona period. There was no intention to write a book. It was totally, this is something to do with my father.
So what would happen after he left every day?
Well, after he left, at the beginning, I was exhausted, okay? But in between, we'd have a little schloof, we'd have a little nush in between the hours, and no one was in a hurry. For the first time in my adult life, I was not going anywhere. I told a few friends very quietly, and they said, "Are you writing it down? Are you recording your conversations? Because in here are the names of all the people. Oh, yes, I know them. I remember them. Oh, really? And he's learning the story of what I have always claimed are the happiest days of my parents' lives. I'm not taking away from me being born, my brother being born, taking us to the chuppah, all of those family things. But beyond that, those were the days. And I've always felt that it was giving him the backstory. Now, there are things that he says, yes, I remember, things he forgot, and things he doesn't know if he ever knew them and he forgot. And then a few friends said, "Are you writing it down? Are you recording?" And I said, "No, maybe you should." And so I thought, they're right. So we sat on our couch with our blankets and I'm starting to write. Dad didn't ask what I was doing. I think it's a combination because I'm always writing and making office wherever I go. I think, he's thinking he, she's again. And we would read something in the story and Dad would then make a comment, add something, subtract, correct them, right? If something was wrong, there were a few, according to him, some errors. And then I use that as material to prompt him. Well, tell me more about this, or how about that? Did you remember this person? And that's what we did. And I jotted down the book is not, I'm not retelling another book, but I'm using that book to prompt my father to tell me about his experience of that time and that place. And so I did start writing it down, and then he'd leave a few hours later. I'm sort of one way exhausted, and otherwise I couldn't push him out quick enough because I would then quickly get out the laptop and I went like a bat out of hell, writing and writing and writing.
Okay, so we'll move on to Jenya's prologue in a moment, but what happened when you finished that book, Frances?
Okay,
we're still in lockdown.
I know, we're still in lockdown, and this took months and months and months. And I'm thinking, what am I going to do next? A number of the survivor students, that's my term, named in the book, and some I've met because there had been reunions over the years in Israel and America of these students. And I actually accompanied Dad to one in New York in 1998. So I've met some of these people. And some of them had written their own memoirs and they had gifted them to Mum and Dad. So I took them for Mum and Dad's place. So I knew they were going to be the next books. So I had sort of bought myself a bit of time. I knew that what I'd be reading next. So they were the next books that we read. And then again, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And so what I did then, I started Googling all the other people that were named here. I found a few more, Book Depository them over. And time went on, so we go like this, and then I start thinking, what am I going to do? And I start thinking that, what if we read Shoah memoirs? I don't read that.
So I think, well, your dad describes the two of you as masochists. So
Okay,
isn't
there's a hilarious part. Yeah, I won't read it because I know it by heart. It's basically, he comes every day and we are reading Shoah memoirs. That's what we end up reading. So the structure of my book we'll talk about later. So it's a book within books within books. It's my dad's reaction to the reading, me asking him questions, our conversation, and then it's my ruminations of all of what I've just talked about. That's what the structure is.
amazing.
And there is one time where we sit down and Dad says, you know, we're masochists. I said, who? He says, us. We look at each other, we laughed together, howled with laughter, and began.
Thanks, Francis. Jenya, could you please read the prologue to your book? I should say in 2013, Jenya gave a speech here that later she adapted to be the prologue of her father's book. And yeah, if you're up to you,
Okay, I might stay here.
you're staying there? Okay.
If I don't strangle myself with my glasses first.
Okay.
Still no good.
Yeah.
Okay. Can I suggest you put it behind you? Thank you. Is that all right? Ein kurzer Überblick von mein Leben, a short overview of my life, not as a writer, because as a writer I have no talent and not enough education. But I wish to leave behind this story for my beloved sister, who is more likely to survive. She's in Russia with her dear husband and children. Their names are Marcus Lichten and Esther Lichten, born Kluska. They should know what has happened to our family and how they were annihilated. This is my goal. So begins my father's journal, now yellow and faded with the passage of many decades. The journal, some 100 pages in total, was penned during 1943 and 1944 in Jędrzejów, the town of his birth, while he hid in a fireplace hearth in the home of a neighbouring Pole. Yitzhak Meir Kluska, my dad, was an ordinary man, kind, intelligent, hard-working, intensely loyal and loving, proudly Jewish. Yet he lived an extraordinary and inspirational life. To my brother Jack and I, he talked only of the present and the future, nothing of the past. As we grew older, we knew somehow that he had endured terrible suffering and loss. At some point, we even knew that he had written a journal during his darkest days. But he never spoke of it. It seemed that his mind, his heart, his very soul had a need for silence. Our father passed away in January 1990. We did what so many others do in the days of the Shiva and subsequently. We pulled out the precious few photographs that he guarded. We recounted memories and shared stories. And we took out the journal, which lay haphazardly and unceremoniously in the bottom drawer of his desk in a simple brown plastic folder labelled with his name. For many months, Jack, Mum, my uncle and I worked to translate the journal from Yiddish into English. It became our evening ritual. My father's beautiful, even script belied unbearable pain. His words spoke of poignant grief and empty days, the passion of bleak despair. His writing admitted us to his inner life, something that he had never allowed us when he was alive. He wrote of his life before the war. We saw his youth, his energy, his creativity, his idealism, and his political activism. We were warmed by the love that he expressed for his wife, the romance of their courtship, and his unbridled joy at the arrival of a child, Regina, on the 3rd of April 1937. We ached for his loss. I ran back to say goodbye and tearfully kissed my dear wife and my darling daughter. I had to leave them. As I turned away from them, my daughter asks me, "Daddy, where are you going?" Her question haunts me. We ached for his harrowing sense of guilt. I condemn myself. I committed a murderous act. I shouldn't have listened to anyone. I should have gone with my family to die together with my dear wife, child, parents, and sisters, instead of remaining alive with a broken heart. Where did he find the strength to write, to preserve this record of his thoughts and emotions? The more we translated, the more we hungered for details. We wanted to know everything, the dates, the times, the descriptions. They were all there, precise, clear, in black ink, drenched in sorrow. He writes in painstaking detail of the events of September 16, 1942, when the Jews of Yangeev were ordered to gather in the marketplace. This was the last time my father saw his family. Together with some 170 men deemed fit for work, he was taken to a barrack in the ghetto where they were assigned to forced labour. It was here that he came to learn from an eyewitness of the terrible fate of his wife, daughter, parents, and sisters. On September 17, at about 4 p.m, the transport arrived in Treblinka. They were unloaded, 20 wagons at a time. By 10 p.m, none who had left our town, excluding a handful selected for work, was still alive. By December 1942, life in the ghetto had become intolerable. At random, people were pulled out and shot. There was an outbreak of typhoid. Those who were able to began to make preparations to go into hiding. In February 1943, my father had a dream in which his wife came to him and told him it was too dangerous to remain. It was time to go into hiding. I arrived at our bunker. We looked around, wondering where we could fit a fourth man. Our hiding place is the foundation of a fireplace hearth. It is 2 meters wide, 1.8 meters long, and 3 meters high. We have light and a bunk bed. During the day, the bottom bunk is removed and the bedclothes stay on the top bunk. In the back of the small space, we have made a table and a bench out of boards. As we translated, we became familiar with names, aunts, uncles, cousins, neighbours. Speaking their names somehow conferred life upon them, gave them humanity. They have no gravestones, no Kaddish. Their names written in my father's beautiful hand are their only memorial. The more we learned, the more questions we had, the more we wished we had asked. We reproached ourselves. Perhaps Dad had wanted us to ask. Perhaps he wanted to tell us directly, to say the words, to draw comfort from those he loved. We completed the translation as best we could. Now what? Should we publish the journal? Should we send it to Yad Vashem? Perhaps it would serve for research. Should we take it to the Holocaust Centre? No, it was too soon. We needed it with us. That's what Dad would have wanted. That's what Mum wanted. We couldn't part with it. It was to be for our children. So where should we keep it? We knew that the journal was precious, so we put it in a safe, in its simple brown folder, and there it lay for the next 18 years, together with the title of our house our jewellery and other so-called valuables. In March 2008, I was invited to participate in a Jewish leadership seminar, and we were asked to bring along a special item, artefact, or document that informed our Jewish identity. My brother collected the journal from the safe. We were dismayed at its condition. The writing had faded. The paper seemed to be disintegrating. The time had come. We would have the pages repaired and treated. Perhaps we should have it professionally translated. Jack would do it. He was the one who always got things done. When Jack had a mission, he was a force to be reckoned with. In January 2009, our world shattered when Jack suddenly died. We grieved. There is a void in our lives. Despite its forbidding countenance, sorrow possesses great potential to push us forward, to complete, to perfect, to honour and heal. There seems to be a greater urgency. In 2010, we had the journal repaired and preserved by the Centre for Cultural Material Conservation at the University of Melbourne. In 2010 and 2011, the journal was professionally translated. And finally, more than 70 years after it was written, the journal has been published for future generations. On completion, the original, together with this translation and publication, has finally come to an honoured resting place, the Jewish Holocaust Centre in Melbourne, where we know it will be forever safeguarded. My father's journal belongs to our collective memory, for in the end, it's all about memory. We are the generation born after the darkness. We absorb the memories, the words, even the silences of the survivors. Sooner or later, willingly or with resistance, we accept the obligation of our legacy to save, preserve, and transmit the memory. We become the storytellers, the bearers of the message. We become the researchers, the guides, the teachers, the curators, and the writers. We must carry the wisdom, the promise, and the memory. On the 8th of August 1943, my father wrote despairingly in his journal, "I often consider the same question. Is it worth all this suffering in order to survive another few years? To live? For whom?" My father lived another 45 years after emerging from the bunker. He responded heroically to the challenging biblical summons, "And thou shalt choose life." My father was thankful for his new life. He had for whom to live, his children, the children of his children. Nicht mit Tint nor mit Blut und Tränen. The history of the Jewish people should not be written with ink, not with ink, but with blood and tears. My father set himself an onerous task to make known his story. Das ist mein Ziel. This is my goal. It became our sacred duty to complete his task.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
I did okay. We hope that we have fulfilled his testament. It's not. Nearly.
Jenya, you went to a lot of effort to find out what happened to the other people who were in hiding with your father.
Yes.
And because in the epilogue of the book, you wanted to really explain all of that. And also you had to do a lot of research to understand certain sections of the diary. Do you want to talk a little bit about the background research you had to do before we could publish this book?
Yes, when we talked about publishing the book, my sister-in-law Judy and the girls and the boys, we talked about publishing the book, and Dina suggested that we come to Romy and Georgie, and I felt very smug. I had the prologue written and we had all the documentation and everything. And Romy and Georgie said, well, you've got everything here. That's, you know, it's complete. But then slowly they prodded and they pushed and they prodded and they pushed. And then I found out that I had to write an epilogue as well. But in the meantime, I had to do all the research. So I worked very closely with the late Philip Maisel to explain things in the diary that I didn't understand. We prepared footnotes, not like a historian would, I guess, but footnotes so that when our children and grandchildren actually read the diary, they would understand. Because my father talks, for example, when they were rounded up, you know, they were rounded up by the Gestapo and the Germans and the Ukrainian collaborators. And, you know, what were the Ukrainian collaborators doing there? So those are the things that historically we tried to explain throughout the diary. But I also managed to get in touch with the town hall in Yengev and also with some historians there, and they were able to give me some information, including the map of the ghetto, including some photos from the deportation that actually corroborated the details that my father wrote about. And my father wrote about neighbours, about friends, about family. And so at the end of the book, again with the encouragement of Georgie and Romy, we listed every name that he mentioned and what we knew had happened to them. And in some, it was fate unknown. But actually, to list those names is the only memorial of these people. So we listed everybody, whoever we knew, whoever, you know, my father mentioned. There is a list of those names at the back of the book.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time. There's so much more that we had planned to cover tonight, but I did want to just say, first of all, that Ron's book and Francis's book are available for sale in the foyer, and so is Michelle Huppert's magnificent book, which is called Malou, French Resistance Fighter, which is about her mother. But Jenya's book is not available for sale. Every year or two, I ring her and say, are you ready? Are you ready to publish more copies and make it available for sale? So I guess I'm asking you again tonight.
No pressure.
Are we going to print any more copies?
Well, it's a discussion over the years, and my nieces have been approached and I've been approached, people who want to buy the book and or people who want to write an article about the book or to talk about it in a Good Weekend magazine or even to make a film. We haven't really discussed it in depth, and I think it's a future discussion, but somehow I don't feel I have my father's permission for that. And so we printed 50 copies. We distributed them to family in America and in Israel. Only family hold these copies. And for our children, for my nieces and their children and my boys and their children, there's enough copies, and there's a couple of copies here at the Holocaust Centre. So no further discussion. I guess it's, as a family, it's a discussion to be had.
And I will continue to nag her. And I will just show this to you because it is a particularly special book and I encourage you all to look at it. We'll have it on display on the table outside, but the title is here and there's like a magnetic clasp, and the original Yiddish diary is on one side. You can see the scanned pages, and then the edited translation is on the other side. So and there's a picture of the briefcase that
just a brown plastic
the
briefcase.
brown plastic briefcase that
and for us it was important. None of our children are going to read Yiddish or speak Yiddish, or the grandchildren, unlikely. But our children still understand a bit, but it was important for us that they have my father's hand as part of it.
I'd like to thank you all so much for being
Thank
here
you.
tonight. Georgie and I have got a really
detract. I want to thank all of our participants for their superlative efforts to publish and for sharing your stories, those powerful stories with us tonight. Your books will be treasured here, and as I indicated earlier, a few pages of Jenya's father's autobiography will actually be on display in the new museum. So when's it opening, I hear you ask? So first of all, we've never closed in terms of school students. So there was, apart from that very brief first lockdown, where we frantically created an online museum. So within a matter of months, we were educating students again. We taught survivors how to use technology remotely because we couldn't go into their houses. We delivered iPads, and so that the schools still were hearing from survivors. It was a real incredible effort. And so even when we moved back in here, we did it during school holidays. So there was never a day that school kids were not being educated. But in terms of the general public and the museums, we're still installing them. We're down to the last few months, and I'm really hoping by August, and let's just say by Rosh Hashanah, in the new year, there'll be a new museum. In fact, there'll be 2 new museums and an incredible memorial space and many more, many incredible stories for us to share with you. So please come back with your family and friends. This is an important place for our community, and it won't thrive if you don't actively participate in what we have to offer, which is a lot. So I just want to leave you with the thought that forgetting a crime is actually a crime. So I want to thank Romy and Georgie and all the other publishers of memoirs for your efforts to keep memories alive. You're welcome to stay, chat with the panelists. Really encourage you to have a look at this amazing document that we have on display. Have a bite to eat, buy a book maybe, and look at our wonderful library, one of the very special spaces that you actually can visit tonight. So thank you very much for coming.